pop-ups or anything. Alrighty. That should be good. Yep. Okay. So let's share.
And while you pull that up, I'm just going to do a brief intro for the recording. So again, this is Education Endpoint Office Hours. I'm Garrett Chandler. I've got Richard Balsley with me today. And again, it's November 15th, 2022, and we are doing a tips and tricks session. So thanks for joining. And Richard, take it away.
All right. So Garrett and I were talking yesterday about actually about managing Edge. And I don't know that a lot of folks are really aware of some of the stuff that we can do with Edge in Intune. So if we go into, I'm just looking at my Windows configuration profiles here, and I've got, in my environment, I got just a ton of stuff because I'm constantly doing all sorts of testing for various customers. But one thing that I like to do with Edge is if you go and create a settings catalog profile, you'll find in here that you can basically configure just about everything in Edge. Now, I know a lot of folks don't use Edge, but those that are using Edge for management that might have been having some issues with like the first run experience. I don't know if you've ever just opened up Edge and you've had the first run experience and it comes up asking you all sorts of questions. It asks you to set the synchronization up for the account or for the user that's signed in. It's asking them to set up synchronization and all that kind of stuff. And so if you are a full Microsoft district, which we have a few of those, at least out here on the West, I've got a few that I actually work with, and they don't want the kids to have to go and configure all of their Edge settings. And so in settings catalog, it's very easy to do. I've on my screen here, if you want to take a screenshot of this or look at the recording after the fact, but these are the settings that I generally recommend, primarily for schools that are K through 12, but higher ed could probably use some of this as well. But these are just the things that over time that I've started setting for customers as we're going through and getting Intune set up for them. And so like things like allowing the recommendations and promotional notifications from Edge, things that kind of pop up. If you use Edge on like a personal browser or something like that, it's going to pop up and tell you about all sorts of things that you probably don't care so much about. And so we generally disable that. Blocking ads on Bing search, disabling that. The full tab promotional content. I don't know that I've seen this pop up, but anything that basically says promotional, advertisements, all that kind of stuff, just always disable that. Bing Safe Search, we do that, but also Google Safe Search and YouTube Restricted Mode. Turn all three of those on or enable all three of those. If you don't do that, I know like with YouTube, if you go and browse to YouTube and you have it turned on for restricted mode, the students won't be able to see comments. So if they look at a video, that's fine, but they won't actually see any of the comments in there because you've turned on restricted mode for YouTube. So I always turn that one on. But then when it comes to synchronization, we don't want the kids to be prompted for anything. So forcing the synchronization of browser data and not prompt for the sync consent, just turn that on. And what that's going to do is going to synchronize the favorites data. It's going to synchronize all of the user data so that if the device breaks, if they need to swap their device for something new, then they go to the next device and all the stuff that they had in their Edge browser, all that stuff is synced with them. So they don't have to go and recreate all that stuff. And then also hiding that first run experience. If you're not hiding that, then you're going to basically just be prompted with having to go through and set up Edge for the first time. Also disabling the shopping mode. This basically is what prompts you, like if you go to Amazon or some site where you can purchase something, it'll basically prompt you and say, hey, you can save X amount of dollars on this product or whatever. And then you opt into that, and it just kind of gets you down this path that if you're a student, we probably don't want them to go through any of that.
But I want to save money, Richard.
Well, hey, with inflation the way it is, I mean, yeah, so we've got shopping mode, but then also hubs and sidebar. So if you've turned on the new Edge recently, there's a sidebar on the right-hand side of the screen that shows up with a bunch of other things that you can do. And then you can also put tabs on the left-hand side. And so you basically start to like consolidate your viewing area with Edge when you have two sidebars basically going. So if you don't want the new sidebar experience on the right, then you can go ahead and disable that.
Yeah, and in addition to that, Richard,
Yeah.
some of the content that can be published inside of that sidebar, I've heard from school districts, I have not personally seen it yet, but I have heard from some customers that the apps or those sites that live within that sidebar actually are exempt from any content filtering. So
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So any content filter, if you specifically if you're a K-12, just go ahead and disable that sidebar to save you any trouble. It's kind of like extensions. They kind of live outside that realm of content filtering. So
Yeah.
it's a good tip to disable that.
Yeah, definitely a good point. I actually hadn't seen that, so very cool. The rewards experiences, turn that off. And then one thing that, and this is primarily going to be more K-12 focused, but sites that can access audio and video capture. If you've got students that are using like Flipgrid, which again, it's going to be probably mostly the younger students, those students that are using Flipgrid, in order to, if you're using the browser, you're not using the app, you won't be able to, or it'll prompt them to access the microphone or the camera on the device, and that can be somewhat confusing for students because there'll be like a little prompt up in the URL bar or near the URL bar, and they'd have to go and turn on the microphone or turn on the camera. And so what you can do in Edge is you can basically say that these websites that are listed have the ability to just automatically have the camera or the microphone enabled. And so you can put your list of apps. So if you have something other than Microsoft or Flipgrid, then you can go ahead and do that. But I just put these in here as an example, but you can add others as well. Also, password manager. This is something that, and this is going to be completely up to you. I disable this so that way the students actually aren't prompted to turn on the password manager. So if you've got a bunch of different passwords or something like that, Edge has a built-in password manager just like LastPass or something like that. But here I disable this because you don't want these prompts to just keep coming up for kids every time they enter a password somewhere. It just gets kind of annoying, especially if it's the younger students. So we turn that off. Again, this is something that you can determine if it's fine for your environment. You can go ahead and enable that stuff. But again, I generally just turn it off. And then lastly, homepage and the new tab page. One thing that's interesting is that if you wanted to just have Office as your homepage URL, and you set everything up in this as I've got set up here on the screen, what you'll find is that when you open up Edge and you go to Office, it doesn't actually sign you in. You don't get SSO. In order to get SSO, there's a special URL that you have to use, and it's what you see on the screen here. If you put a question mark auth equals 2, then Office will actually SSO you directly. You'll just get signed in directly into in office.com, and you'll be taken to the main Office portal, and then you can go to all the Office web apps. So it's a pretty interesting little hack to put this in there, because if you don't do this, again, it'll actually prompt you to sign in, it's really strange behavior. I don't know exactly why we do that, but auth equals 2 seems to take care of it. And then one other thing that I wanted to mention, because Garrett had mentioned the content filter thing with the sidebar. One other thing that you should be looking at, most of you are probably already doing this, but news and interests and widgets. So if you let me get my taskbar back here. That's good. Okay. So in Edge, or not Edge, in Windows 11, you've got the widgets bar that you see over here on the left. That widgets bar in Windows 11 is called widgets, whereas in Windows 10, it's called news and interests. And in Intune, if you try to create a settings catalog policy with both in it, and then you're targeting both Windows 10 and Windows 11 devices, your Windows 10 devices will give you errors if it's trying to remove widgets. And your Windows 11 devices will give you errors if you're trying to remove news and interests. And so what I do is I separate both of these out into two separate settings catalog items. That way my reporting for Intune doesn't show errors for things that don't apply to the operating systems that the thing you can't control. So when we look at news and interests, how I'm handling this is I'm targeting to a group. In this case, I just target all devices because I don't want this on anything. So I'm removing news and interests, but I'm filtering this to all Windows 10 devices. And I don't know how much we've actually talked about filters. I'll go into those here in just a second. But for the configuration settings, it's basically just set to news and interest or not allowed. So if you were to go into your settings catalog, search for news, then go to feeds, and that's where it enables news and interest is. So just select that and then select that as not allowed. But how do we filter this down to just Windows 10 devices? So if we look at the filter, so we've got to go out of here, go to tenant admin, go to filters. Now I've got a ton of filters here, but for Windows 10 and later, just click on this one. And what this is going to look like, if you've never used a filter before, very similar to when you create an Azure AD dynamic group, same sort of syntax. And so for my rule, what I'm using here is basically my device OS version starts with 10.0.1, and I'm looking at Education, Enterprise, Professional Edition, or Cloud Edition. The reason I'm looking at these different SKUs is because I also could have server as well. I have servers in my environment because I've tenant attached my SCCM environment to Intune. And so I don't want servers to be impacted by this. Now, I don't want to include servers in my Windows 10 filter because it's not Windows 10. And so by doing this, I'm able to just strip out the servers and only include my Windows 10 devices. And for Windows 11, it's pretty much the same thing. We look at Windows 11 and we edit this. It's not on. So basically 10.0.2, and so same thing. And so by doing that, I filtered out both Windows 11 and Windows 10, and now I can start targeting things to these filters. And so when we deal with filters, the thing about filters, I guess, let's kind of talk more about why we would use filters as opposed to groups, because I could have easily just created a group, done the exact same thing just with groups. But the reason why we want to use filters over groups is speed. As you probably know, with Azure Active Directory dynamic groups, it takes a while for devices to fall into those groups. And all of the grouping and targeting, well, all of the grouping, I should say, not targeting, all of the grouping is done through Azure AD, which is outside of Intune. And so we created filters really to speed things up. So you could have a large group, of users, and you can filter on just specific device types. So for instance, I've got a group here, I've got a filter here called Laptop Go. And so for this filter, what this is doing is it's basically looking for, I really got two things here. I'm looking for device name starts with something. So in this case, it's CONT for Contoso. And I've got the model equals Surface Laptop Go. I could take this out if I don't care about the name and I just want to look for specific models. So if I want to create a filter, I can basically just say, or if I want to filter on just Surface Laptop Go, I could just create this and then I could target a group of users, but only their Surface Laptop Goes. So imagine having students and they've got cart devices, and all the cart devices are the same model, but then they also use lab machines, and you've got policies that need to go to those users. But you don't want the policy to hit the lab machines, but you do want the policy to hit their cart machines. And so if you had that kind of scenario, you can use a filter to say, I want to target this to this user all the time, but I only want it to apply to just specific device types. And so that's just one example of how you could leverage filters to delineate between two different device types that one user might use. And so So I don't know how many of you guys are using filters, if you've played with them, but if you have, put something in the chat there and we can talk more about filters if people are interested in them. But I highly recommend using filters for speed purposes instead of making a ton of dynamic groups. Because of the speed, how long it takes for devices to fall into them, leveraging filters can drastically speed things up when it comes to deploying things, because filters are only an Intune construct. They're not in Azure AD. All right. Garrett, did you have something you want to share?
Yes, were you done with everything that you were showing?
I'm done for now. I'm gonna flip to you and then
Okay.
I can go back.
Okay. Yeah, I don't actually have anything prepped, but I can share my screen really quick. So, one of the things that we're having a lot of conversations with customers on is how do we make this shift to full cloud native endpoints, right? So how do we shift completely from on-prem to cloud? So that might mean going from on-prem AD to Azure AD, or hybrid Azure AD to Azure AD, and then even from a management perspective, group policy to Intune, configuration manager to Intune, a third-party MDM to Intune, right? And one of the things that specifically when it comes up with group policy is how do we take the existing group policies that we've invested in and mimic them in Intune, right? We just want to do a copy paste. Now, there's pros and cons for if you want to actually copy and paste. And we've got some cool tools within Intune to be able to help you with this and kind of analyze what your existing environment looks like. So one of those tools is the group policy analytics tool. And that is where you could actually go and export your group policies from group policy management console on your domain controller. You could import those group policies into the Intune console, and it'll analyze and help you map the corresponding CSPs. But when it comes to security, and this is the tip that I wanted to show you all, is firewall. And a lot of times we're configuring the firewall through group policies. And sometimes those firewall configurations are through different group policies. There's not just one group policy, it's a blanket policy in the environment. And so I was helping a customer look at this a little bit, and we're doing a deep dive into the endpoint security blade within Intune. And one of the pieces that came up in the conversation was firewall. And so I actually wanted to share this tip with you all, which is if you have a device in your environment today that has the firewall mostly configured, because at this point, I think a lot of us already have our firewall configured and everything that we need in our environment is set. And a lot of times firewall can be a set and forget. But it's also been built just like group policy over time and time and time, right? We've built and appended this same policy over and over. But one of the things that's really cool that I actually learned about was that we have a tool. We have a firewall rule migration tool. Specifically for Intune. So you can actually download this tool. It's just a PowerShell script that you can run on a reference machine, and it will export all of your firewall migration tools. But it will create an endpoint security firewall policy inside of Intune, inside of the security blade, and I'll show you that really quick. It will need to rename my bookmark here. It'll actually create that firewall policy in Intune on your behalf. So if I come into endpoint security here, this is like all messed up. Hang on. Let's sign out. Oh, it's because I'm using not my demo tenant. Ha ha ha.
You trying to sign into the Microsoft tenant?
I was signing into the Microsoft's actual Intune tenant, and guess what? I don't have access. No surprise there. So if we go into the endpoint security blade, under the firewall, right, we can actually come in and create our firewall policies. And we can deploy Windows 10, Windows 11, right? We have the firewall where we can actually configure the firewall and the firewall rules policy. And so with this tool, you can actually download this PowerShell script, and export all of your firewall rules. And in that same tool process, as you're exporting, it'll analyze them. It'll actually create firewall rule policies on your behalf. And so just when you're looking at doing cloud migrations, or if you're doing a POC and questioning, like, will cloud native management work for me? Firewall rules is one of those things where you just don't want to have to recreate, right? It's a lot of work, but we have a tool for you. So I just wanted to share that because I thought that was super cool and super handy. There is a limit. So if you have more than 150 firewall rules, it'll actually create 2 policies. If you have more than 300 firewall rules, right, it'll create 3 policies. But yeah, that was my only tip that I wanted to share with you all.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting because it's very similar to that old the Microsoft MDM. Was it MDM? It was MMAT, but I'm trying to remember what
the MMAT tool.
Yeah, like
I forgot about that.
It was before group policy analytics, right? And so you'd run the tool against your domain controller and spit out.
But that would just pipe out a spreadsheet, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's similar in that. What I find ironic about it is that we don't, like, why is it not in group policy analytics? Like, to me, it would seem like we should be able to also include.
I think it is, and I'll go back and double check. I think it is, right? Because you can, again, export any of your group policies and pipe that in there. But if you're just trying to do, one reference machine and you're just trying to export those group policies, which is really nice for troubleshooting or even servers, like just understanding what's there. I thought that was a great little tool without having to export your group policies, because that does require access to the group policy management console. So, yeah, that's my tip.
Cool. So Joe's got a question.
Do you want to take that?
What's that?
Do you want to take that?
Joe's question? Yeah. So, how do we troubleshoot conflicting settings? This is a question that's about as old as Intune, right? Like, how do we handle conflicts? Because in group policy, it's easy, right? You've got precedence between 2 different policies. Even in SCCM, we've got prioritization that we can do for client settings. And even in Intune, in some instances, not for configuration profiles, but for some things, there's prioritization. If you've got like device restriction rules and things like that, you can prioritize. But for actual policies, for configuration profiles, there is no prioritization. So if you've got 2 settings that conflict with one another, who wins? And the answer is no one wins. The admin, if you look at the documentation, it says that the admin has to resolve the conflict and just decide who, pick one and then delete the other profile. But specifically to what Joe's asking here about his tapeworm, I'm sorry, about the Defender for Endpoint baseline config. I'm going to show my screen here again. So this is funny because Garrett and I were actually having this conversation yesterday about a customer.
About MDE.
This is around Defender for Endpoint, but it's not so much Defender for Endpoint. It's really about the security story all up. And there's some history here. So with Intune, this node over here that says endpoint security, this hasn't always been there. This was added 18 months, maybe 2 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's been here for a little while now, but it hasn't always been here. And so what customers had to do before the endpoint security node was there to manage Defender. I'm not even talking about Defender for Endpoint. I'm just talking about Defender antivirus. In order to manage your exclusion rules and stuff like that, you had to make a configuration profile just like you would for anything else. And then for the profile, you would go into device restrictions. You create this, give it a nice fancy name, and then down here for Defender antivirus, you'd go and configure all this, and then you'd leave it and you never touch it again. You put your exclusions in and then just not touch it, because the only time you would really want to touch this is if you're adding new exclusions, like you've got a new app that's there, or you're troubleshooting something or whatever. You'd go and modify your exclusions, but for the most part, you pretty much don't change how the antivirus behaves. You set it once, and then that's even if you do set it. You may not even set it at all. And so you would have this policy here. But then, some point in the future, we added some other ways to manage Defender, right? So I talked about the endpoint security node, but if you go into here, and I don't know if endpoint protection has it. I'm just gonna double check this one real quick.
Just if the antivirus policies are there?
Yeah, so there's.
Yeah.
Is there? No, I don't see antivirus is not in here, but just notice that there's a bunch of Defender stuff to control in this net, right? So there's more Defender stuff here, but not antivirus. But if we go into settings, well, actually, before we hit settings catalog, admin templates. I think admin templates have Defender as well for antivirus. Maybe not. Okay, so there's no antivirus there. Oh wait, no, we do have antivirus. It's just you had to go up one. But you've got antivirus stuff that you can configure through Defender, through here. And then settings catalog, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the same as well. So between the three of those, settings catalog, device restrictions, and then admin templates, you could set Defender antivirus policies all through there. And then you've got some other things, right? So then we also have security baselines, which I think Joe mentioned. I think security baselines are actually under endpoint security.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about this. So endpoint security. This is the place to go to manage all of your security settings. So if you were setting up security settings for Defender antivirus, all the other stuff that I kind of breezed through some of that stuff. But if you've got stuff that's set up in device restriction profiles, if they're set up in setting catalog or whatever, this is the place that our product team wants everyone to go and set all of their security settings. So if you've got an antivirus profile set up with exclusions and everything, come in here, migrate it over. Like there's no migration tool. Like you can't just like go select one and put it up. Like you'll just have to go and create the new policy and add it here. And so why am I kind of belaboring this on when it comes to conflicts? Because there's so many places that you can set this stuff. I've seen a number of customers get stuck with this. But what also happens in an education tenant, and I don't have the policies in here right now because I deleted them, but there are default education policies that get set up in your tenant because you're an education customer. And in your tenant, if you go to your configuration profiles, you might see like default EDU policies. Like if you just look for like the word default in your environment, and if you see like default anything, those are policies that were created by Intune for Education. And some of you might be like, what the heck's Intune for Education? Well,
but even higher education has Intune for Education.
Right.
If you're
exactly.
an EDU tenant, you have Intune for Education.
Exactly. So even if you're higher education, and most of you in higher education probably don't even know this thing exists. But what this is like our take on like the Google Management Console and managing K-12 devices in a much more easy to use manner. But most of our larger education customers don't generally use this. They use the full Intune portal. But what this portal does is what I can do is I can reset everything to default. Okay, so I'm going to restore all of the default education settings. And what this does, come back over here. It's adding a shared PC policy. It adds default policies for EDU, and it adds an addition upgrade policy. This one right here has Defender settings in it. So if you drill into this, you'll see down here, Defender antivirus, and all this stuff is turned on. And so if you're seeing conflicts because you just created your own Defender antivirus policy or something that includes at least one of these, then you'll see a conflict that comes up. And I've seen this happen a lot, especially in higher education, because they have no idea this stuff is even here. And no one tells them to go through and delete it. And so they end up with conflicts and they're like, where the heck did this conflict come? Like I just literally set this setting today and there couldn't possibly be a conflict. Well, it's because we put some stuff in here for you that you don't want. So my recommendation is to remove these because you're probably setting your own. And that's how you're going to end up in a situation where you'll have a conflict. But in terms of figuring out and troubleshooting your own conflicts, it's a super hard thing to do. But luckily, though, when you look at a device and you look at what's conflicting, generally, you should be able to see, if you look at two different policies and it says that there's something in conflict, you should be able to see that you've got a couple different policies. I don't have anything that's conflicting right now. Well, now, I guess technically now I do because I just turned this thing on. But it'll take a while for my devices to consume this and then tell me that there's a existing conflict in the environment. So that's definitely one thing that I would suggest you all take a look at and see if these three are there. And the thing is that when these are on, they hit all devices. So like shared PCs turned on, but it's really not completely turned on. It only is really turned on to flag the device as education because there's education policies that we add with shared PC. But the shared PC settings aren't actually enabled, just the education policies one. Again, you don't necessarily need that. And so you're safe to remove the three of these and then set things the way you want. I'll pull these out.
And Todd's got a good note. Just knowing when a conflict is identified and that it is difficult to know what specifically is in conflict and how to address it. I think we have. I think that's good feedback. I think we have some work to do. I actually think Intune for Education does a good job of reporting conflicts.
It actually, so that's actually a good point. There's some things in here that I like, even for higher education customers. And one of those things is knowing who the last logged on user was of a device.
Yeah.
And so this is something that I share with customers all the time because everyone asks me, okay, it's great that I've got a primary user, but sometimes I don't have a primary user. If I provisioned with a provisioning package, or if I did autopilot self-deploying, I don't have a primary user on the device. It just shows up as blank or none. But I want to know who the last signed in user was. And it's so funny that Intune, the full Intune portal doesn't show this, but Intune for Education does. And so in Intune for Education, if you go into reports and you go to device inventory, this shows you every device, shows you who enrolled it, but then it also shows you the last signed in user. And so you can export this out to a CSV file and you can sort, filter, do whatever you want, but it gives you the last check-in time, last signed in user. So if you have a device that's been stolen, you have no idea where it's at, maybe someone left it on a school bus or something, you can go ahead and search and see who the last signed in user was of that device and go contact them to figure out what happened to that device.
I think you can actually look up the device in Intune for Education and see that as a property in the hardware. I don't think you have to go into reports to do that.
No, yeah. So, well, I mean, if I just look at any device, right? So
yeah,
look at something that just recently checked in. Let's try. Let's try this one. You can, but it's a little weird to do it because in the recent check-ins, there's a drop down up here at the top. Once it loads, I should be able to. Well, I don't know if I've signed in multiple or with different accounts. Yeah, I haven't. But if I had signed in with like multiple times or different accounts, then I would see the different drop downs here for the times that someone signed in. So you can also see, as Garrett was mentioning, those check-ins that happen this way, or you can just use the report and just search for the device name, and it gives you the same kind of data. So this is something you will not find in the full Intune portal. You'll only find it over here. So
in big Intune.
Yeah, and so everyone has access to this. If you're an education customer, actually even non-education customer, I think if you even had like a Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 tenant, I still think you're able to get into here. It's just intuneeducation.portal.azure.com. What else? Oh, so you were talking about conflicts. So in
if I recall, do you recall seeing this? Yeah.
It's right there. Yeah. So if you also go to reports in Intune Education, go to settings there. This is where you'll see conflicts as well. And so Windows Update notifications. And click here to review it, and then shows the machines that have been impacted by it, and what group it's targeted to. So
the hard part about that is that it doesn't show you which configuration policy it's in, so that you can go undo it. Right.
Right. Yeah. Like what we need is right below this, right below where it says conflict 1 of 1. Give me the name of the profile.
Yeah.
And then you can show me the subsettings below it, but I need the name of the profile so I can go do something with it. Because if it's like this, okay, it's great, but how do I know? Like, how do I know where this is? You know, like, is this in settings catalog? Is it
that 2 policies, or is each one of those in a different policy? Or that's the hard part.
Yeah. Because even if we drill into this,
that it doesn't even tell you.
Doesn't even tell you here. It just tells you what's impacted, but you have no idea. Yep, I totally agree. Like the whole conflict thing to me is like this has been a problem for so long. I've banged my desk on this one to anyone who'd want to listen to it, but there's work that's being done. It's just taken them a long time to get an answer here. So it's a tough one to deal with. But yeah, so those are the 2 things that I generally, even if you're not using this portal, it's kind of nice to have, this kind of report. I wish that we just kind of pull this over into full Intune. But one other thing here is something that I don't look at enough, and I don't know that a lot of people look at it, because when it comes to reporting, most people just think, okay, I'm just going to go to reports. And you'll notice that there's not a lot of reports here. There's not a lot of things, and we're adding, got a bunch of preview things. We're adding things to this to make it better. But this monitor node down here, I don't think a lot of people use this. And there's a lot of good things that actually come out of this node. One of those, if you're doing autopilot, your autopilot deployments will actually show up in here. And I may have shown this on a call a while back. I think once actually, I may not have shown this, but anyway, in here,
I think we talked about this because now we upload the logs remotely, and we just highlighted that feature, but we haven't done an in-depth on this.
Yeah, and so as Garrett mentioned, we can actually get the logs if you click on a machine, or you could. I don't know where'd that go.
It should be there.
I thought it was
up at the top. It's at the very top where you see registered date. I mean, there's a button that actually says download.
Yeah.
But I think it's only on failed deployments.
Oh,
that's what it is.
Yeah. I guess it doesn't make sense to upload everyone's
right.
logs. I think if like when you kick those logs out, it's like 4 gigs, or I'm sorry, it's like 4 megs compressed when you run MDM diagnostics tool. So that'd be pretty expensive for us to store that for every single autopilot deployment. But what you'll notice here, it took 6 seconds. I don't know if that's entirely true. Seems really fast. But yeah, what you can look at though here is this deployment time. So you can see how long your autopilot deployments are taking, which again, I don't know that a whole lot of people have actually come to see that you can actually look and see how autopilot's doing in the environment. But as Gary mentioned, also for the failures, you can download the logs and see what failures have taken place. If you're using, like in my case, I did self-deploying. So if you had a failure with like TPM or something like that, you can get those logs remotely as opposed to hitting Shift F10, running the command locally. You can get them from up here.
Heads up, those logs are not pretty. Like when you download it, it's a zip file, and then it's like a bunch of folders, and they're labeled like 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then they'll go into like A, B, C, and you kind of have to pick and choose. So just a heads up.
Yeah, it's actually better now. We do name the folders now. We didn't originally.
Oh, we do?
We
Are you
do,
sure?
yeah. Yep.
Okay.
100%. I
There
just
you
don't
go.
know. I just don't know if I've got a device here that's already got them.
Or are you talking about the collect diagnostics feature?
Collect diagnostics, it names them there. I don't know if autopilot is doing the
Right.
same
I
thing.
think in the collect diagnostics feature, it names them, but in the autopilot failures, it doesn't. I could be wrong. I'll go back and look. But
Yeah. We should double check that because I would imagine we want it to be consistent. Because I do know now when you collect diagnostics from here, it will name the folders. It used to not. They used to all just be like 0, 1, 2, 3, and you had no idea what you were looking at. You're just basically just poking around.
Yeah.
That's better now for these, but for the autopilot stuff, it's been a little while since I've tried to download those logs. Okay, so back to monitor. Yeah, so this is where we just kind of see our assignment status, assignment failures, various other ones. I've used this. I don't know how many of you guys are actually pushing certs, but if you are using NDES, pushing out SCEP certs, this is a good place to actually look to see what certs have been issued. So not sure how many of you guys are using that, but I've got a few customers that are. Encryption report for your devices. They got TPM2. I reboot and reimage all the time, so I get a bunch of things that show up as unknown and got VMs and all sorts of weird things. But for your physical devices, you should see like the encryption status, encryption readiness, all that fun stuff. So there's a lot of good stuff here to poke around. I'm not going to go through all this. One thing that we are doing though with updates is for your feature update deployments and your expedited update deployments. Both of those also we've actually got like two places where we're doing reporting on these things. We've got here, but then we're also adding under reports and then Windows updates. These are the feature updates and the expedited updates, not just your regular Patch Tuesday updates that are coming through your update rings. So if you're setting up your feature updates through the feature updates node or the expedite updates through the expedite updates node, you'll have reports for that here. But you will not have anything for the regular Patch Tuesday updates. Patch Tuesday updates go through update compliance, which we've had a few sessions on already. That's where you would want to look for any reporting on your Patch Tuesday updates every month. And then lastly, endpoint analytics. With endpoint analytics, there's really two things I want to talk about here. The first is scripts, which obviously is not even under endpoint analytics. But quite a few of you are probably deploying PowerShell scripts out to your devices. And this is the old scripting method that we've had in the console for a while. It uses something called the Intune management extension, just like when you push a Win32 app. On your machine, there's this Intune management extension that gets installed. So if we just look at a device here, I'm just going to go to services. Microsoft. Interesting. Why am I not seeing? Unless it's. Hang on. Let me go to a different machine. This one's actually broken. This is the good one.
It's important to have both good and broken machines in your lab at all times.
I've got mostly broken machines. I've got mostly broken machines in my lab. All right, so the Microsoft Intune management extension. So with MDM management on Windows, there's actually two agents that are in play when we're managing a device. There's this.
Wait, don't say it. Who knows? Throw it in the chat if you know.
There's a pop quiz.
Yeah. Obviously, he's highlighted one of them.
But what's the other one? What's the name of the executable? What's the name of the exe?
Does anyone know? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, Richard, go ahead and say it.
All right, so there's the Intune management extension we're looking at right now. Then there's also the OMA DM client. And so if you go into Task Manager, you should see, I don't know if it's actually running all the time, but if you've just provisioned a device and it's getting policy and downloading things, you should see, yeah, it doesn't run all the time, but you should see in here an OMA DM client, OMA DM client.exe. You'll see that executable. And that's responsible for actually applying all of your policies. But this Intune management extension.
Now, wait, Richard, let's clarify really quick. The OMA DM client is baked into Windows.
Correct.
Is it specific to Intune?
No, it's not.
Right.
Yeah, so that's the built-in
standard MDM channel.
Correct. That's the built-in MDM client. So that client is what communicates to Intune. It communicates to AirWatch, Mobile Iron, whatever third-party MDM that you might want to use. Right. That client is what is responsible for doing all of the MDM work.
Exactly.
So when you're pushing out a policy, the third-party MDMs like Mobile Iron or AirWatch, or I guess Workspace ONE, they need to meet our CSP standards, right? Like we've got these configuration service providers on how you like push out all of your policies and settings. When they create their MDM, they have to use our CSPs and code to what those are in order to deploy a setting. So when Windows is communicating to their MDM, Windows understands what the MDM is actually sending down. So the OMA DM client is what's responsible for all the policies that are coming. So when you create a configuration profile and you're setting your Defender antivirus, that's what's doing that work. What this service on the screen is doing, this is responsible for your Win32 apps. It's responsible for your scripts when you push a PowerShell script down. And then it's also used for proactive remediations. And there's a few other things that it's also responsible for, but those are the primary things that you would be actually deploying. And so Garrett had a question to me yesterday. He's like, I'm pushing out something with a customer and it's like taking forever. Like, how do we like make this go faster? And it's like, that's a great question, because when you're pushing like a Win32 app, it may not show up right away. It could take an hour for it to show up. And you're just like, why is it taking so long? It's because this service right here checks on an hourly basis. Kind of like,
but it doesn't get notified.
No, it's not notified. There's not a push notification. Right. This is actually kind of like the SCCM client. Todd was like kind of joking about collections and filters. This is kind of like it's not the SCCM client. It's not CCM exec. It's not that at all. But it's similar. It's checking every hour, just like the SCCM client by default pulls policy every hour. This is doing the same thing. Checks every hour to see if there's something for it to do. And then it's going to go ahead and do that. And so why am I taking so much time on this? Well, when we go back over here, we deploy scripts. So scripts originally came out at the same time that we introduced this Intune management extension. You might hear us refer to this thing as sidecar. Mm-hmm. And so the sidecar agent, or the Intune management extension, was developed, and the first thing that we actually were using it for was to deploy PowerShell scripts, because we couldn't deploy scripts. There's no script capabilities with Intune. And so when we introduced the Intune management extension, we were then able to deploy PowerShell scripts out. And so this was like V1 of scripting. And if you've ever used this, you know that it's kind of rudimentary. Like you push out a script, it runs once, and then that's it, and never runs again. And so there's no scheduling. It's not dynamic at all. But if you see in my environment, I pushed a lot of scripts out, because I removed a bunch of apps that I don't want for Windows. I've got, Teams and Edge desktop icons that get kind of littered on the machine if you've got OneDrive set up for known folder moves. So I've got a bunch of little scripts that I run to pull things out. But what we should be doing is actually moving these over to proactive remediations in endpoint analytics. So what's the difference here? Because I just had this question the other day from a higher education customer. They're like, hey, I want to run a script on a schedule. How do I, am I only supposed to do that? Like, am I supposed to make a task, like a scheduled task on the machine and run it that way? And I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. You can, but writing a PowerShell script to just always run scheduled tasks, it's kind of annoying having to do that. Like we've had tools for like 20 years, like SMS, SSM, or we could run things on schedules. We should be able to just do that through our MDM, and you can. You do it through a proactive remediation. And so think of this as like our PowerShell scripts, but kind of on steroids, because we can do a lot more here. So if you haven't seen proactive remediations, they effectively work they work kind of like configuration items in SCCM. So with a configuration item, you can deploy a CI out through a baseline, and then you can also have a remediation component to that. But there's no requirement to have have the remediation component. You can just have a detection component to just detect something. So let's say that we wanted to detect that like a registry value is set to 1, and if it's not set to 1, I want to remediate that and set it to 1. So it could be like maybe it's set to 0 and it needs to be set to 1. And maybe it's not a GPO, right? If it's a GPO, you just go ahead and set the GPO and you'd be done with it. But maybe it's something that's maybe internal or something like that. So you can detect something and then remediate it after the fact. So it's pretty simple. But you wouldn't ever be able to do this with the old scripts scenario that I was mentioning earlier. There's also really no great reporting. It basically just says, did the script run, yes or no? But over here, we actually can report as well. I don't know if I don't think I have anything deployed. Well, I've got this one here. I might have some reporting data here. Yeah, so for this check Windows activation, this basically, I think, is just looking at WMI. Actually, let me just look at the scripts. Yeah, so this is just doing a check in WMI just to validate to see if the machine is actually activated or not. There's no remediation here. So the script just runs, checks it out, and then reports back the status. And so if I go back over here, so I can see that I've got 3 machines in my environment that I targeted the script out to. None of them had problems with activation. But if I did have problems with activation, then I could also see machines that have issues, fails, what have you. And then see if I had remediation inside of the script, then I could also see how many of those machines actually were fixed. And so I've worked with a number of customers, turned on proactive remediations. We've moved their PowerShell scripts over from just the regular scripts node over to this, because there's a lot more benefit to doing this than just having just the straight up scripts. But if you had just like a quick script you wanted to run, then you can go ahead and still use the other one. We're not really getting rid of it. But Endpoint Analytics has a lot more flexibility into how you want to handle that. And then I mentioned on scheduling. So if we were to target this, I can now run my script daily, or if I want to change this, my frequency, I can just do it once. I can do it hourly, and then set the time however I want. So again, you can do a lot more over here than you can just with the regular scripts node. And with that, we're at time. I know that there's some stuff.
Yeah, I just want to I want to kind of finalize one of those thoughts there, right? One of the questions that I was having around like speeding up app deployments or speeding up script deployments through the IME, if you simply restart that service on Windows, that'll force that check-in. So if it checks in on an hourly basis, let's say the device just checked in or IME just checked in, and then you push the application, instead of waiting for an hour, just restart that service, and then it'll notify IME will check in, it'll pick up that new app deployment or script deployment, and it'll execute. So that's one of the cool pieces that you can control about the IME. You just go into services and restart that service, and just great for testing purposes when you're pushing new apps or scripts. So
Yep, great call out. I forgot to.
Just gotta finish the thought there.
Awesome. I
Awesome.
got too many thoughts.
I know. Thank you all. This was super fun. Again, hopefully you picked up a few things here and there. We want to do on December 13th call a community tips and tricks session. So look for a forum, and if you have any cool tips or tricks that's 5 minutes or less that you want to showcase that you're using at your district or university, I would love to have some awesome participation from this group in showcasing just things that y'all do, creative solutions. There's nothing dumb. Don't be shy. Everything is awesome. Everyone's always learning something. So look for a forum and some additional details coming forward. But get to thinking about something that you'd like to showcase. And with that, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We are thankful for each and every one of you and for participating in EDU Endpoint office hours. Again, the recordings are on YouTube. I will throw the link in the chat so you can see this, and have a safe and wonderful holiday. Bye,
Thanks, guys.
everyone.
Take care. Happy Thanksgiving.